Good morning. Welcome to today's 20-minute update, BCF's monthly series of interactive live calls to give you a look at the work we're doing here at BCF, our initiatives, and things going on here in Baltimore City and the county. Good morning, everybody. Before I get started, as always, I just want to take a minute to thank all of our Civic Leadership Fund donors who make calls like this possible. Thank you so much. If you have not made your civic leadership gift this year, consider doing that after this call. Okay, today we're going to talk about the Kirwan Commission, and joining me today to talk about that is Joe Francaviglia, who is the Executive Director for Strong Schools Maryland. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me.
Great. So I said we're talking about the Kirwan Commission, and for those who may not know, I think probably most people on this call will know what the Kirwan Commission is. It's actually called the Commission on Innovation and Excellence in Education, and that's a state commission that has been examining the ways in which we might be able to improve our state education system to bring it to a more world-class level, to bring it in line with some of the best school districts in the world. And we're also talking today about how we might pay for that. So brought Joe in today just to talk a little bit about the state view, because he obviously covers the entire state with his work. And so before we launch deeply into that, I just want to give you a chance to tell us what Strong Schools is and what, your purview and charge is.
Yeah, so first of all, again, thanks for having me. It's great to be on the BCF 20-minute update. So Strong Schools Maryland is a statewide, nonpartisan, non-political 501c3 whose sole focus is making sure the Kirwan Commission recommendations both are as bold as possible, become passed through legislation in the General Assembly, but then we also have the funding formula to make sure those recommendations become a reality and they don't just end up as grant programs. And so what we do is we organize statewide, we organize the grassroots into what we call teams of 10. And so we have about 200 teams throughout the state in 21 of the 24 counties who meet every month, learn what's going on, are incredibly informed about the Kirwan Commission, and then take action, whether it's reaching out to local leaders, it's reaching out to statewide electeds, members of the Kirwan Commission, to make sure that their voice is part of the process. And then we also, we're part of coalitions. We co-chair the Coalition for the Blueprint for Maryland's Future, along with Advocates for Children and Youth. We engage stakeholders, we meet with lawmakers, we do a little bit of everything.
So you mentioned those teams of 10. What do those actually look like?
So it's teams in any sort of anyone that wants to be part of a team. So it could be a synagogue, it could be a church, it could be a local book club, it could be a PTA, a principal, whatever it might be. Once a month, they bring about 10 people together. Some are much larger, so we put 10 on average. And they get a packet from Strong Schools Maryland, some information that says, here's the latest updates on the Kirwan Commission, here's where we need to make sure that we're focusing, here's where we need to apply pressure, and we actually provide them information and an action. Because what we learned, especially after the 2016 election, is people are very hungry to be involved, and They want to be part of the civic process, but it's such a big undertaking to get involved, and sometimes you feel like your voice doesn't matter. So what we do is we provide those opportunities for people to both be informed and have their voice heard in a way that we can actually see change, and we've actually gotten results. And so it allows people to say, I want to get involved. I might not know where to get involved, so here's a good avenue to have my voice be part of the conversation.
Great. And now that you've mentioned that, I'm sure that there may be some people on the call who'd be interested in that later. So maybe you can give us a call to action at the end.
Great.
Okay. So we talked a little bit about, how the commission, they made a bunch of recommendations, content related, and you can actually find more information about that on our Kirwan website, which is going to be scrolling at the bottom of the screen during this call. But we want to talk a little bit about the cost of this. Mm-hmm. And about 2 weeks ago now, October 15th, a proposal was released by the Kirwan Commission to kind of, it's not set in stone. It's obviously a draft version of how the state and the local school districts, the counties, and the city can come together to pay for this.
Exactly.
Can you tell us, maybe give us a little outline if you can? I know this is a complex issue, but maybe just hit the top line.
Yeah, so in order to get fully into the funding formula, we might need like the 6-hour update because school funding formulas are incredibly complex. So I'll do my best to give you just a brief overview and kind of how the commission was thinking about it. And so the commission was made up of 25 members, and then they produced this subgroup or this working group to focus specifically on the funding formula. So when the full commission came up with their recommendations, they said, here's what we need to invest in. And they named the 5 areas, and they said it's going to cost $3.8 billion. And so they asked the funding work group to come up and say, how do we actually fund this with the state and the locals? How much should each pay? And so the work group was charged with this, and they took their work with kind of 3 overall thoughts. The first is we need to make sure it's adequate. We need to make sure it's equitable, and we also have to keep in mind political considerations, because at the end of the day, this is a political process,
right,
and this has to be passed into law. And so under the adequacy bucket, they met their goal. The commission said we need $3.8 billion. They came up with a funding formula that fully funds all of the recommendations. And so there was a lot of nervousness that maybe they'll scale it back. They decided, no, if we said it's going to cost $3.8 billion, we need to make sure we fund $3.8 billion. And then on the equitable front, that's a massive conversation, and we need to make sure that our schools have an equitable funding formula. Right now, we have one of the most regressive formulas in the nation. We need to make sure that students who need the most get the most. But we also need to make sure that all jurisdictions are able to adequately educate their students. And so in the equitable front, they also met their goal. They did something that hasn't been done before in the United States. Right now, we fund students with a base per pupil, and we've added on additional weights for students who are English language learners, students who receive special education services, and students who are considered to be from low-income backgrounds receiving free and reduced price meals. What the commission did, which is completely innovative, is also to say we need a 4th funding category, and we need it for schools in concentrated poverty, because we know you need different resources when a contingent of students in a school are all considered to be low income. It just takes different resources. It's not better or worse, it's just different, and we need additional money for that. And so they added this 4th weight that is concentrated poverty that the districts will be receiving, and it's for schools, and all students within that school will receive the funds, whether they're considered in poverty or not. And so that's completely innovative, and that's a massive step towards equitable funding in our public schools. And then the third is political considerations. At the end of the day, this needs to pass. It needs to get enough votes in the Senate and the House of Delegates and the governor's signature, or if the governor chooses not to sign it, there needs to be enough to override a veto that he may or may not offer. And so we need to make sure that this isn't reappropriating money from one jurisdiction to another. This is growing the pie for everyone. So it's more money for all schools. And so I know we're going to probably talk about Baltimore City and Baltimore County more explicitly, and I'm happy to jump into that overall. But it's every jurisdiction will see significantly more money after this is fully phased in, and it's a 10-year phase-in period. And so we're not saying we need $4 billion tomorrow. It's actually growing at about 5% every year. So this is incredibly manageable, and it's affordable, it's sustainable, it's equitable, and we need to make sure we get this done.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. I think there's been some misconceptions in the media that at the end of whatever legislative session, there's going to be $3.8 billion in additional spending right away.
Right.
But this scales up over time, and when you get to that 10th year, then that $3.8 billion is in place, and that's what moves forward after that.
Right.
Okay. And I had one follow-up question about the concentrated poverty. You said that it's on a school level.
Yeah.
That's how they're doing it. How are they calculating that exactly?
So that's a really good question, because that's actually one of the most contentious issues, because we know right now, especially in the national climate, that we're undercounting students who are considered low income, particularly from immigrant communities. And so we need to make sure that we get accurate counts. And so both Baltimore City Public Schools has weighed in, advocates have weighed in, and there's conversation to make sure that we count students correctly. And so it'll likely be a combination of things. One, we need to make sure, especially for direct certification districts like Baltimore City, that we continue to allow students who receive free lunch and free breakfast. Everyone should continue to receive that. And so to count students, if we're not filling out forms anymore, they've decided to do what they call direct certification, but then add Medicaid. So anyone that's using any social services get counted, and they've expanded it to also count Medicaid. But then there is discussion, because of the national climate and because of a lot of what we're seeing in the federal level, that we will need to have some kind of form, whether it's filled out every 1 year, 4 years. That's a conversation that I think the districts will be having, but some kind of way to capture income that will not be shared with the federal government. That is a state-issued form. And I know Baltimore City is piloting some, and we look forward to seeing some of the results that they come back with in the next month or so. So there's a lot of different ways, but the advocates have been on top of this because it's millions and millions of dollars that schools are losing. I mean, the New York Times, Erica Green highlighted John Rura, and that's a perfect microcosm of the larger problem.
Yeah, that was a great story. Okay, since we're kind of segueing into Baltimore City and County, tell us a little bit about the responsibility of each jurisdiction and how that works.
Yeah, to highlight what the counties will end up with and what the city will end up with at the end of 10 years. At the end of 10 years, so 2030, Baltimore City's public schools budget will increase by $832 million. That's game-changing money for Baltimore City public schools.
That's huge.
That is, if you're an education advocate, if you care about the city, if you care about making sure that our students have what they deserve, this is what they need, and this is what they deserve. And so that split will be about $329 million more locally and $502 million new dollars from the state. So the overwhelming majority is going to be coming from the state. In Baltimore County, it's an additional $436 million, with $88 million coming from the county and an additional $346 million coming from the state. And again, that's after a 10-year phase-in. Now, as an education advocate, I would say we need that money yesterday.
Sure.
But we also need to have that conversation about like what is equitable, what's sustainable, what's accountable, and what's affordable. And the formula that they came up with is exactly all of those things. And so this isn't any new money. This isn't $3 billion tomorrow. It's a gradual rollout where they, implement different things at different phases. And it's also important to note there's no new local contributions needed until FY22 at the earliest. And so there is a bit of a runway to allow the city, to allow the counties to begin to figure out how they'll implement it at scale. And we can also get into some of the funding issues because I know this comes up a lot. But one of the things that the state is picking up for Baltimore City, Baltimore County, and most jurisdictions except 6 is that concentrations of poverty is going to be completely funded from the state.
Okay.
There will be no local share for concentrations of poverty. All of that money will come directly from the state, which really allows some of the equitable conversation to happen.
Yeah, and I think we're probably too early right now to speculate on how each jurisdiction is going to raise that revenue,
right.
Just because there's so many questions. So that FY22 buffer really is the time when these jurisdictions will be discussing it with their constituencies to figure that out.
And that $329 million that Baltimore City will have to come up with, it's not $329 million in FY22. Again, that's a 10-year phase-in, and so there's plenty of time to have that conversation and figure out what that does and doesn't look like.
Okay, I'm sure a lot of people will be happy to hear that. So we talked a little bit about this with the teams of 10 at the top, but what is Strong Schools Maryland's strategy here now that this big proposal is out? Where do you go from here?
So Strong Schools Maryland was founded like right at the beginning of the Kirwan Commission, specifically to focus on the Kirwan Commission. So we've been doing a lot to make sure that we're engaging stakeholders in the grassroots. We've spent a lot of time the last 2 years traveling the state, building these teams. We now have the infrastructure in place, and so it's continuing to execute on a strategy that we have, but also implementing a massive communications campaign. We know that there's people out there that don't want to see this pass, that are raising money to make sure it doesn't pass, and so we need to make sure that the voices of those that do want it to pass, and I'm sure that we'll talk about some of the Goucher polling coming up, but Marylanders want this to happen, and so we need to make sure that the winning message gets out in front of people. And so we're also engaging key stakeholders. We're making sure that they understand what's all in this because oftentimes when you have a 242-page report, it seems so overwhelming that the easiest thing to do is, put it over here and say, I'll get to this soon.
Right.
So we break it down and say, here's the top 5 things you need to know. Here's how that's going to impact your county. And so we really give stakeholders in those counties the ability to have those conversations. And then we're also engaging lawmakers. They need to know that their constituents want this. And they have questions. They have legitimate questions, so we work to get them the answers because we know lawmakers are thoughtful in how they approach this. And so they want to get this done too, but they want to make sure that they can talk about it in a way that makes sense. And so we engage their constituents to talk to them about the need and also answer some of those questions that they may or may not know. And then we're also going to be in Annapolis. Last session, we were in Annapolis 3 days a week. We were incredibly visible. We're going to continue to have that because the more that constituents are in Annapolis and the less it's, faces of lobbyists, faces of opponents, the better. And so we bring constituents to Annapolis every single weekday when they have session in the morning. You can't escape us. You're going to know that this issue is the top issue in the state.
And I guess just a quick follow on to that, how, from your experience as an advocate, how valuable is it to have those constituents in front of lawmakers? I mean, what effect does that actually have?
Incredibly valuable. So I can go and talk to a lawmaker until I'm blue in the face, but if their constituents come and talk to them, that means so much more, because those are the people that are voting for them. Those are the people that they're serving. And so I do what I can to, give them the information, some of the technical details, because we're not expecting every constituent to be a PhD in the Kirwan Commission funding formula. So what we do is we provide them the technical information that they need, but then we empower those that they serve to have their voice heard and say how it's going to impact them, how it's going to be implemented, what they want to see, what they want their lawmaker to do, because those are the conversations that move lawmakers from, okay, I have questions, to I'm ready to vote for this.
Great. Okay, I'm going to pause just for a minute because we have a couple audience questions that were sent in. Audience, if you're on the conference call line listening on your phone, if you have a question, go ahead and hit *6 on your keypad. That'll unmute you, and then you can ask the question. Just pause for a sec if you want to ask a question. Okay, hearing none. I have 3 questions here, and I want to just ask the first one to you, Joe. So this came from our email, and the question is, I'm hoping to learn if and how nonprofit partners working towards goals identified by the Kirwan Commission are included in the funding formula. For example, will nonprofit partners be able to apply for funding directly, or must they be included in an LEA application?
Good question. And so the answer to that is still to be determined, because the legislation has not been formally written and voted on for this upcoming legislative session. What has happened in the past is that nonprofits do need to partner with an LEA for funding. And so nonprofits are definitely a big part of the conversation. A lot of extra services are going to need to be provided. There's going to be significantly more money, and these services from nonprofits that are already happening need to be integrated into the school. But the money does flow to LEAs, which will then have to partner with nonprofits.
Great. Did I hear someone on the phone trying to ask a question?
That was actually my question that was being read. So no, I don't need to say anything. Thank you for the response.
Perfect. Thanks for listening. Okay, so you mentioned the Goucher poll, and there was a poll that came out from Goucher College just a week or two ago, maybe a little bit longer than that, but it found that 70% of Marylanders think that our state spends too little on education.
Yes.
But only about 22% of people know about this huge commission that's been working on this for what, 3 years now?
Yeah.
So given that gap, what do you think is going to take? What's really going to take to get this done? What's the key
so
thing?
I'm glad you raised that, because a lot of people do raise this, and the Goucher poll as well as the Washington Post poll that had very, very similar results. People say, oh man, only 22% know what the Kirwan Commission is. And I actually respond to that by saying, holy cow, 22% of people know what the Kirwan Commission is. This is a state commission chaired by a former university chancellor, like not the sexiest thing that ends up on the front pages of every newspaper. But what I was heartened by looking at those Goucher results is that 70% of people say we're not spending enough on our schools. 74% of people are willing to tax themselves to pay for it. People understand there's a problem. There's not a debate about if there's a problem. Just because someone can't name the word Kirwan doesn't mean they don't understand what the problem is. And Kirwan is addressing what people are feeling. And so when I see that 22% number, we need to work to make sure we get that up. And we're going to continue to have that public relations campaign. But diving a little bit deeper into the numbers, 33% of people, according to a Johns Hopkins survey, can't name their governor. 80% of people can't name their state legislator. That doesn't mean those folks aren't important, and that doesn't mean people don't have opinions on it. It just means that when we talk about these issues, just because we don't have the specific vocabulary of Kirwan doesn't mean people aren't incredibly informed about the state of our schools and aren't demanding change, because it's very, very clear according to these numbers, people are going to demand change, and that change is what Kirwan Commission is offering.
Great. We're getting close to the end here. I want to try to get in a couple more questions. So I have another question about teaching here, and I'm going to try to paraphrase it because it's kind of long. So the question is, how does the Kirwan report envision both helping teachers get better I guess, get better at teaching and ushering ineffective teachers out.
Yeah.
And then sort of the follow-up to that is it's challenging to do both, professional development for teachers while they're trying to balance this huge portfolio of work.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. I think that actually gets at the heart of what we were looking at when, what the Kirwan Commission was looking at when we talk about both high quality and diverse teachers and leaders, which is 1/5 of the report. So part of it is we need to make sure we're supporting teachers that are currently in classroom the way that other professionals are supported. So that means salary increases. That also means career ladders so that we can see constant improvement. And it means that we need to also diversify the teaching corps so that it's reflective of the student population. But we also know that working conditions are one of the biggest stressors for teachers that actually drive teachers out of the profession. And so we need to bring in a massive amount of teachers into the state, and we need to grow the teaching force, because if we're expecting teachers to be the mental health worker, the social worker, the psychologist, the lunchroom monitor, like that the question's absolutely right. Like, that's where burnout happens, and it's impossible to continue to get better if you're going to be tasked with 15 different jobs. And so we need to allow teachers to be teachers. We need to pay them like professionals. We need to support them, but we also need to create the working conditions that allow them to succeed. And that's what Kirwan has done, and that's actually one of the most inspiring parts of their recommendations. And on top of that, we know principals are the biggest driving force behind school effectiveness. So there's also principal support and principal career ladders that's really focused on how you develop teachers and how you support teachers.
Great. And just a quick aside, last month we did a call on childhood trauma where we talked a lot about early childhood education and just how much teachers really have to be cognizant of all these issues that are not part of teaching per se.
Right. And that's a big part of the Kirwan Commission as well, is making sure that there's trauma informed, that we're looking at the whole child and not just, tests and academics.
Great. Okay, so we have one more question, which I'm not going to be able to get to, but it's about what BCF is doing to support this advocacy work. And I'm going to post that on our Facebook comments. So for the person who sent that in, I apologize that we're not getting to that. Okay, we're over 1 minute, but I want to just ask sort of the last question, which is, how can people that are watching today help get this done?
So 3 big ways. Number 1, financial support. If you're able to and willing to, you can donate at strongschoolsmaryland.org. You can contact me directly at joe@strongschoolsmaryland.org, and we can have that conversation about what that might look like. We need to get in front of 6 million people, and financial support is what we need to make sure we can get that done. In addition, you need to connect with influencers and make sure that they know what's going on and push them to make this their top priority, whether it's your pastor, whether it's your PTA president. Everyone needs to be involved. And then the last thing is, you need to push your lawmakers, and you need to tell them you expect them to vote yes. And not only do you expect them to vote yes, you expect them to whip votes in other counties and expect them to be a champion, because a yes vote's great, but we need champions that will go to other lawmakers who may be on the fence and drag them over the finish line, because that's what we need. We need champions in the legislature.
Okay, great. So on that note, we're going to just close up our call today. Joe Francaviglia, thanks for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
I thought this was very informative, and we could, like you said, go on for 6 hours about it. But thanks for everyone who listened, our civic leadership donors, for making this possible. We're going to be back next month on the 14th, so just 2 weeks away, and we're going to be talking about BCF's new LGBTQ fund. So hope that you can join us for that, and until then, take care. Thank you.